咁咧就我哋好榮幸咧，就係今日咧就係請到好高興啊！邀請到猶太教利亞堂嘅拉比咧，就 Oser 到嚟我哋中間。Today we are very honored to have Rabbi Oser of Leah Synagogue to be with us. Rabbi, before this lecture, shared with us that his presentation will be a little bit different. He has also no PowerPoint, I think. But we are very honored to have you here, and we are looking forward to what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming this morning. Thank you to Father Ha for inviting me, and for Amy for helping me come along, and Professor Long as well, who's our good friend who does so many tours for the synagogue. This is a difficult presentation. It's difficult for the organizers as well, I imagine, because some of us are clergy people, clergymen I can say perhaps, and it is difficult to keep us to a set time, but I will endeavor to do my best to go over by no more than half an hour. So that's a joke. Okay. Some years ago, there was a visiting scholar, a very spiritual person who was staying with me for the weekend. And I brought him to services on Friday night. And you have to understand, this man, he meditates for many hours a day. And he came to the synagogue on the Friday night service, and he sits down and he begins to meditate. Now, Friday night in the synagogue, that's the beginning of the Sabbath service for the Jewish people, and people are coming from work, and people are coming and seeing each other for the first time in a week. And the Friday night service is also a little bit elaborate. There's sitting up and standing down and bowing. And at one point, we actually turn to the door of the synagogue. Right, we turn to the door of the synagogue to welcome the Sabbath Queen. And while all this is going on, and people are chatting and talking and standing and sitting and bowing, this guy is quietly sitting down and meditating, seemingly oblivious to everything that is going on around him. So much so that a security guard appears in the sanctuary of the synagogue, which is very rare, and he goes over to him and he taps him on the shoulder to see if everything is okay. You see, someone was worried because they'd never really seen this before. And he told me afterwards, this man told me, this synagogue, Oser synagogue, is a place that has been prayed in. I could feel the prayers, and I was moved to sit there and absorb them. It's funny because nobody else at that moment felt that way. So what does that tell you about a building? What does that tell you about people who are used to the building, people who are not used to the building? It's an interesting reflection. I'm not an architect, never designed any type of building, but I have prayed in synagogues in many different locations. And I think we all know that a beautiful building and a sacred space has the power to transport us to a different world. But at the same time, for Jewish people, a sense of the past, of standing somewhere that Jewish memory has sacralized, also has great power. When the columnist Charles Krauthammer, he recently passed away, they asked him, "What sort of a Jew are you?" Only a Jewish person can ask someone else, "What sort of a Jew are you?" He said, "I am a Jewish Shinto. I believe in ancestor worship." And as the horrors of the 20th century recede, what has emerged is a cottage industry of Jews returning to places where Jewish life used to exist. And in some of these places, all that roams today are the ghosts of collective memory. But that, it seems, is enough. In the last 12 months, I have visited synagogues in 3 cities where almost no Jewish presence remains. Dubrovnik in Croatia, Worms in Germany, and Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. What drew me and other Jewish people to these sites is not the style of the building, even when they are beautiful. And the little synagogue in Dubrovnik is exquisite. These things are secondary. What drew me is the memories that these places hold. And so I would argue that Jewish liturgical space extends to almost any place where Jewish people lived Jewishly. Today, throughout Germany and other European countries, one finds stolperstein. These are brass plates created by the artist Gunther Demnig that commemorates martyrs of the Holocaust. They are put on the pavement in front of buildings where these martyrs lived. And almost every day one is placed somewhere. A few years ago, Demnig also started doing this for survivors of the Holocaust, meaning no longer do we only wish to mark the places where people died, but also the places where they survived and where they lived. But let's get biblical for a moment. In the Jewish imagination, the first place of worship was the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that traveled with Israel through the desert. The verse that describes the building of this tabernacle in Exodus 25:8 reads, Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. The rabbinic interpretation points out that the verse tells us betocham, among them, not in the sanctuary, but in the hearts of each and every person. Our true purpose is not so much the building, but the sanctuary of the heart. And I suspect that one reason this interpretation became so well known and so popular in the Jewish tradition is because for much of history, Jewish houses of worship were less grand and less impressive than those that surrounded them. Not just because Jews tended to be a minority and that this led to smaller buildings, and not just because various laws at various times limited the size of the synagogue, but also because more often than not, these communities did not survive. Perhaps they knew they would not survive, and so they were destroyed and fell into disrepair. To know that the true purpose of the sanctuary, of the building, is to allow God to dwell in our hearts is a balm of consolation. And sometimes there were tragedies within tragedies. Today, Thessaloniki is Greece's second largest city. But on the eve of the First Balkan War, it was still an Ottoman city, the city of Salonika, a great port city under the Ottomans. It was a city that was dominated by Jews. When Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, visited the city in 1911, he remarked that it was a Jewish labor city, the only one in the world. He was a socialist, so this was important for him. It was a place that stopped on Saturday. Even the post office was closed. A city with scores of synagogues. But there was a great fire in Thessaloniki, not an anti-Semitic fire, just a fire. And it destroyed 32 of these synagogues. And when the Germans occupied the city, All the remaining synagogues, except for one, was destroyed. Some years ago, I visited Thessaloniki, and I prayed in a synagogue that is housed in an urban office building. It was a weekday morning. The inside walls of the synagogue were covered with plaques that remembered Thessaloniki's former synagogues and the years they were established, serving as a safe haven, not only for Jews escaping from the Iberian Peninsula, but also for a variety of Jews fleeing from elsewhere. Because under the Ottomans, Salonika developed a reputation as a Jewish refuge. The names of the city's synagogues recalled the diverse geographic origins and cultural backgrounds of their founders. Many synagogues bore names referring to places in Spain and Portugal, as well as Italy. Others referred to France, Germany, and Hungary, and North Africa. And the oldest congregation in the city was known as the Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. It was nicknamed the Congregation of the Greeks, for it was established by Jews in the 1st century. So I'm sitting in this synagogue, and enveloping the walls of the synagogue are plaques. And each plaque has on it the names of former synagogues that used to be in this city. Synagogues, most of which were destroyed in the Great Fire of 1917, some of which were destroyed by the Nazis later on. First one, of course, was Eitz Chaim, the Congregation of the Greeks. And then from 1492, the year that Spain expelled her Jews, there is a flood of new congregations. 1492, 1497, 1502, 1505, 1510, 1520, 1525, 1535, and each synagogue has a plaque on the wall. These walls were broadcasting a tragedy within a tragedy. The names of synagogues and communities that had fled across an ocean only to have their flames extinguished in a citywide fire. Sitting there that Friday morning, I was transported back and forth between the past and the present. The plaques on the wall beckoned me to the Jewish past, and the prayer book in my hand had its requests for daily bread and forgiveness for trespasses. And this returned me to the present. It was a surreal experience. For not only did this space contain its own memory, it somehow tried to co-opt the memories of an entire Jewish diaspora that had come to settle there. But memory is not incidental to the synagogue. It's not just another outcome of the historical memory of Jewish life and the tragedies of Jewish history. From the outset, the synagogue was designed to beckon us to the past and perhaps also to the Jewish future. If the temple in Jerusalem was known as the Beit HaMikdash, the house of the Mikdash, of the sanctuary, the rabbis termed the synagogue a Mikdash Ma'at, a mini temple. The phrase Mikdash Ma'at, those Hebrew words, are taken from Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 16. Lachein emor ko amar Adonai Elohim, therefore says the Lord God, ki hirchaktim bagoyim, although I have cast you out among the nations, v'chi hafitzotem ba'aratzot, and I have scattered you in all the lands, ve'ehi lahem, I will nonetheless be for you lemikdash ma'at, a little sanctuary, ba'aratzot asher ba'usham, in the lands that they will come to. Some translations take this phrase, mikdash ma'at, a little sanctuary, to mean a sanctuary for a little while, for a little bit of time. But the general Hebrew thrust of the Hebrew interpretations is that it refers to a small sanctuary, which the rabbis called the synagogue. When we refer to a synagogue as a little sanctuary, what are we saying? A little temple, a mini temple. What does this mean? Well, there are two possible understandings. One is that it is a miniature version of the temple that stood in Jerusalem. Namely, just as the site of God's temple forever retains its holiness, so too the holiness of the synagogue remains forever. Once designated to be a synagogue, that sanctity is there and remains there, and nothing can affect it, much like the site of the temple in Jerusalem. But another understanding of this phrase, little sanctuary, little temple, mini temple, would mean that no matter how large or how impressive a synagogue is, by definition, it will never be more than a mikdash ma'at, a small sanctuary, a poor substitute for the real thing. Some Jewish authorities see the sanctity of the synagogue directly related to its use. As long as the community has designated it to be a place of prayer, it's sacred. But if the community decides to sell or abandon the site, then that is fine, for it is but a physical building that has no intrinsic holiness, unlike the temple. You know what they say? They say 2 Jews and 3 opinions. Well, one synagogue has 2 foci. There are 2 focal points in the synagogue. One point is the ark at the front of the synagogue. So if you imagine this would be a synagogue, the ark would be over here. It's where they keep the scrolls of the Torah. The ark points to Jerusalem. The ark sort of is almost a memory of the ark that was in the temple, and that's the front of the synagogue, and that's the direction to which people pray, and that is the direction of Jerusalem. So that's one focus point of the synagogue. But there is another focus point of the synagogue, and that is in the middle of the synagogue. That's known as the bima. It's a word that some of you may know. And it is from that central space where the Torah, where God's law is read. In some ways, these 2 focal points represent 2 aspects of the synagogue. The ark facing Jerusalem points to the past and perhaps to the future. The place of the Jewish past and the Jewish future is at the front. When the ark opens, the congregation stands. Not as a matter of law, but it's a custom. What are they standing for? Ostensibly, for the scrolls of God's law. But perhaps also for memories of the past and for future hopes. The bima in the center represents the present. It is the place from where the Torah, God's revelation, is read. At the center of the synagogues, God's revelation is recreated in the present. Indeed, some authorities believe that when the Torah is read publicly, as it is read publicly every 3 days, from that central place in the synagogue, the congregation should stand when the Torah is being read, to replicate what happened at Sinai, when the congregation stood as God revealed himself at the foot of God revealed himself at the mountain. Now, many synagogues, not all synagogues, but many synagogues have the prayer leader stand somewhere between these two spaces. Somewhere between the ark and the center of the synagogue stands the prayer leader. What is he doing there? I think what he's doing there, you can perhaps understand it to be that what is prayer? Prayer mediates between the past and the present. Reflects on what I did yesterday and where I am today. It also mediates between the present and the future. And so, if the front of the synagogue is where the past is and where the future will be, and the middle of the synagogue is the present, the prayer leader stands somewhere in between. Now, not all synagogues are structured that way. Ohaleah synagogue is not structured that way. So, many of the Sephardic congregations, the Jews are divided among sort of Sephardic lines and Ashkenazic lines. Sepharad means Spain, Ashkenaz means Germany. So some Jews who came from the Levant, from the Middle East, and from North Africa, and from Spain are known as Sephardic Jews. The Jews of Central Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe are known as Ashkenazic Jews. And so in Ashkenazic synagogues, the prayer leader is in the is between these 2 points. Sephardic synagogues, the prayer leader remains at the center. Ohaleah synagogue was built by Iraqi immigrants, Iraqi migrants, and so the prayer leader stands in the middle of the synagogue. I spoke before about the past and the future. Well, for some, the future was changing. The future changes. And if in the ancient times, Jews thought that they would come back to Jerusalem, that's the promise of the Bible. In 1818, a synagogue was formed, and they stopped believing that they would return to Jerusalem. This was the first time there was a Reform congregation. Now, the Reform congregations, they weren't fully rooted in Jewish law. They didn't feel that same devotion to Jewish law. They also wanted services that would look more like the services. Actually, everyone wanted services by that point that would look like the services that other people had, that the dominant culture had. And so they introduced organs and those sorts of things. Occasionally one finds an Orthodox congregation with an organ. How did it come to be? Because synagogues change hands. So as one community leaves and another community enters, you can find that sort of thing happening. I'm going to move to something slightly different. Occasionally some people ask me, how many people does your synagogue hold? And I say, well, it sleeps a few hundred. The truth of the matter is that usually people in the synagogue are not so quiet. Unless it's the sermon, nobody is that quiet, right? Synagogues are quite lively, quite boisterous almost. Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary in 1663, he walked past the synagogue and he says, they had a prayer for the king, which they pronounced his name in Portuguese. Most of the Jews in London at that time in 1663 were Spanish Portuguese Jews. But the prayer, like the rest, was in Hebrew. But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention, but confusion in all their service, would make a man forswear ever seeing them more. And indeed, I never did see so much, or could have imagined there had been any religion in the whole world so absurdly performed as this. Basically, he walked past the synagogue and he couldn't believe what was going on. The atmosphere was too jovial. He did not realize that at that evening that he walked by was a celebration. Once a year, we celebrate the the yearly cycle, when we finish reading the Pentateuch, which we read from beginning to end, publicly, there's a huge celebration. It's a huge celebration inside the synagogue. He just happened to walk by that night where the people were, it was basically a party where the people were celebrating. There was no way that he could have known this. And he said, my God, look at these people. Crazy. I've never seen a religion. What sort of religion? I'm surprised he didn't join. If I walked past a place and they're having a party like that, I may have wanted to join. But he was a serious individual. What happened? This congregation, the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London, they decided that if Samuel Pepys wrote such a damning report about them in their diary, then on this day, which is usually celebrated with great levity, they are going to, from that point on, mark it in a way full of solemnity and with great gravitas. So you see that the people inside the synagogue are concerned what people outside the synagogue think of them. Now, just turning to Ohaleah Synagogue for a moment. You see this also with Ohaleah Synagogue. The architects that were hired for Ohaleah Synagogue were the same architects that built so many other famous buildings in Hong Kong. If you walk into St. Andrew's Cathedral and you see if you walk into St. Andrew's and you see the floor and you see the pews, it looks like Ohaleah Synagogue. Why? Because the Jews who built the synagogue, they wanted it to look good for everyone. They wanted to make sure that when Samuel Pepys walked by, he would have nice things to write. Similarly, when it comes to the prayer for the king. Now, we've been doing the prayer for the government. We've been doing that for ages. It is rooted in an ancient statement, pray for the kingdom, lest, because without it, one person would swallow the other. So every synagogue prays publicly for the government. So when I arrived in Hong Kong and they recited the prayer for the chief executive of Hong Kong, I wasn't surprised. Because in Australia, they recited a prayer, I grew up in Australia, for the Queen and the Prince of Wales, and in the United States for the President, and in Hong Kong, of course they're going to pray for the chief executive. The only place where they sometimes don't pray for the government is in Israel if they're unhappy with the government, right? So that is like in some places that's an extreme, a little bit of political protest, but you would never find that. You would never find that over here. Similarly, you walk into the synagogue at Ohaleah, there is a plaque. What does the plaque tell you? It tells you when the synagogue was built, and it also has a list of the people of the Jewish community who fell in the defense of Hong Kong during the Japanese occupation. This too is very important to the people who built the synagogue to show that they are part of this community. I think I am out of time. I want to thank you for inviting me and for including me in this discussion. I feel part of your community. Thank you.
Please there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. And you said you were out of time. Actually, you're in of time, because last time the previous speaker, he was really out of time. And we had no Q&A time, but now we have. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please be free. Yes, Patrick?
He was much cleverer than me. If there's no time for questions, that's what a clever speaker does.
Pardon my ignorance. I have 4 questions. Does the synagogue reflect some association with temple sacrifice? The Jewish people has experienced a lot of tragic history. Has that somehow affected the synagogue architecture? Is there architectural designs, or has that some effect in the architecture of all these sufferings of the Jewish people, particularly the Holocaust? Is there a difference between pre-Holocaust synagogue and post-Holocaust synagogue? Is there any structural, architectural difference? The third is different historical periods, say even before Christ, or different centuries. Has the synagogue undergone different transformation? And the fourth question is synagogues in different parts of the world. Are synagogues in China exactly the same as synagogues in Jerusalem, in US, in Europe?
I need that's a whole nother talk. But in short, there is no animal sacrifice in the synagogue. Sometimes people come and are surprised, are disappointed perhaps. Where is the animal sacrifice? We believe that the Bible is very clear that outside of the temple there is no animal sacrifice. We don't do animal sacrifice. In terms of the tragedies in the Holocaust, in some places, yes, I remember walking into a synagogue in Cincinnati, and it was like I was walking into a memorial shrine to the Holocaust. Now, the people who came and built that synagogue in the 1950s and the 1960s, who had lost so many members of their family, that was the place they were going to remember them. If you walk into the synagogue at Ohalea's synagogue, right, and the other synagogues in Asia, you will not find any sort of memorial to the Holocaust. Why not? Because over here, it was not a feature. Similarly, if you were to walk into a synagogue in Iran still has a number of functioning and open synagogues, you would not find any memorial to the Holocaust because it wasn't part of their community's story. There are synagogues created at different times in different ways, and some of this is reflected in the synagogue architecture. Where I went to rabbinical school, I walked in every morning, and on the ground, on the floor, was a sort of an astrological mosaic work. That's what we walked into. And that building was built in about 1920, I think. And in about 1915, they uncovered in Kafr Baram and some other places in that region of Israel, they uncovered some synagogues that had those sorts of mosaics on the floor, astrological symbols and so on. And so I think they tried to sort of recreate that original synagogues. At different times, in different places, synagogues were different. So I think that, and that's also true for Asia. The synagogues around Asia, there is a network of synagogues around Asia that Iraqi immigrants built. Shanghai, Singapore, in India there are a number, in Burma, Myanmar there are a number, and they're all in a similar sort of style. Okay?
Any other question? Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your robust talk. And I'm delighted about your mentioning of the two focus points in your synagogue for worship, and in the middle, the prayer leader as the mediator between the past and the present, and between the present and the future in your worship. Out of my ignorance as well, could you enlighten me on the point of what's the woman's place of worship in your faith and in your synagogue, please? Past, present, and look into the future. Please, thank you.
Allow me to be a little bit light-hearted. You know, the place of women is usually I get those sorts of questions in a synagogue sort of setting, especially from Americans. But I forget that I'm at a Catholic study center as well, so I wasn't expecting it, but perhaps I should have. We are traditional. We are Orthodox. We are proudly Orthodox. Men and women sit separately. In fact, the evolution of where the women were in the synagogue is quite interesting, because many synagogues originally, they had no space for women. When I was in Dubrovnik, the synagogue in Dubrovnik is a synagogue, and the women went actually next door to a private home that bordered on the synagogue, and they had some sort of grate in the wall, and when the services were on, the people in the private home allowed them to sort of hang on there and look through the grates in the wall. The liberal synagogues, the Reform synagogues, men and women sit together and women are full participants. In our liturgy, in the traditional liturgy, that is not the case. There is communal prayer and there is private prayer. Only men are obligated in communal prayer, and communal prayer draws on. You can only do communal prayer if there are 10 Jewish men. Private prayer is something different. So women, from a strictly Jewish law perspective, women do not need to come to the synagogue. But, as one of my members likes to tell me, families that pray together stay together. I don't know if that's true, but in a world where people want to sit together, that doesn't work. And we encourage women to come to the synagogue, and we are constantly trying to sort of balance some of that. I'll give you an example. When we take the Torah scroll out of the synagogue, so we walk it around and everyone gives it a kiss. Now, if men and women are on the same floor, then you can sort of work it out so that the women can also reach for the Holy Scroll and give it a kiss. But in our synagogue, where there is a ladies' gallery, nobody's going to take and it winds up a staircase, nobody is going to take the scroll up the staircase to the women. It's just, from a logistics perspective, it is too complicated. So if you were to build a synagogue today, you would build it in a manner which is more gender friendly. But the synagogues of old were not built that way. But they still have a lot of historical value, and people still want to be there. So it's all very, very complicated, and we're all working through this together, probably unsatisfactorily. So.
Okay, thank you. We still have, yes? Brother William.
Good morning, Rabbi. In China, there have been cases of enculturation. We have mosques and also churches built in Chinese temple styles. Do you know anything like that in China, that a synagogue, especially there have been Jews in China for many years, is there any historical evidence of Chinese-looking synagogues? Thank you.
That's a great question. There aren't that many synagogues. In other words, there aren't that many synagogues in Asia. The truth of the matter is that I'm not completely sure. There were some synagogues in Shanghai that are no longer standing just because of development. Nothing more than that. And I don't know. For example, I think it was a family, the Hardun family, who built a very large synagogue in Shanghai. I don't know the style that it was built in, so I can't answer that question. What I can say is that the Torah scrolls have cases. In the Sephardic tradition, they have cases, metal, silver cases, and we had a silver expert recently visit, and he claims that there is a particular style that is more sort of Chinese when it comes to decorating the Torah scrolls than is that is found elsewhere. So I think the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is there probably is some sort of an influence. I can't put my finger on it.
Okay, I think time is up. So thank you so much for your very enlightening sharing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Please have a seat there. So our next speaker, coming next, we have our speaker from the Orthodox Church. And we are very honored to have Metropolitan Nectarios from Orthodox Metropolitanate of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia to share with us the liturgy and also the architectural characteristics of the Orthodox Church. welcome the kindness.